Okay, here we go. And I hope you enjoy the view of Georgian Bay here in Collingwood, Ontario. It doesn't have anything to do with making bread, but I just thought it would be nicer to look at than a still photo while I introduce things. In this video, I'll show you how I make my version of sourdough bread. It's a no-knead method, baked in a Dutch oven. Using the fridge adds some flexibility, so the process can fit more easily into your schedule. I'm not a professional baker, just someone who got into sourdough during COVID. I've done a lot of experimenting, and I don't know if this is the proper way to do it. I just know it works well for me and consistently makes a great loaf. Friends and family ask how I do it, so this video and the notes that go with it are my way of sharing the process. It's a bit on the long side, but I figured it's helpful to see what the starter and dough look like at each stage and how things come together in the process. We will go through the whole process, which is from starter to sponge to dough to shaping and baking. I'm planning to do a separate video on how to create sourdough starter. For this one, I'll assume you already have a starter ready to go. I tried a bunch of different flours and thought I would prefer a whole wheat starter and loaf, but in the end I kept coming back to a local hard baker's flour, which is also called bread flour. I just love the flavor, and it gives me a light, airy crumb, the inside, with a delicious crisp crust. I keep 2 small batches of starter on hand in the fridge. When I'm ready to bake, I build one of them into a sponge, and a sponge is simply a larger active portion of starter that's used to make the dough. Keeping a smaller amount of starter helps me reduce flour waste, but it does add this extra step. I keep 2 batches mainly for flexibility. Depending on the week, I might want to make sponge earlier or later, and I prefer to build it up from starter that's nice and airy, full of bubbles. Since the 2 batches peak at different times, I've usually got one ready when I need it. I'm not showing the whole process to keep the video shorter. I'm fairly particular about amounts. You're missing adjustments. Here there's 10 grams of starter, actually 11, 30 grams of water, and 30 grams of flour. I just showed you what the starter looks like after a week in the fridge. You can see it had some bubbles. It's pretty typical. You remove this starter from the jar and put more than 10 grams on the bench scraper. Then you clean out the remaining starter and clean the jar. A good cleaning, but it doesn't have to be a completely clean jar. Place it back on the scale, and then you see me pressing the tare button to reset to 0. It's a lot easier if you have a digital scale with the tare button. I always use 1 extra gram of starter, and that's when I make starter or sponge. For example, I use 11 grams instead of 10. I want to ensure I have a full 10 grams. For the water, avoid reverse osmosis water. It doesn't contain the minerals that help fermentation along. And then you add the flour and you mix until it's fully combined. It's handy to have a second small, sharp knife. It's easier to scrape the starter off the knife. A note about jars, it helps to use one with straight sides at the top on the inside. It's harder to scrape a starter out of jars with rounded shoulders. And if you're storing in the fridge, return it to the fridge. If you're home, leave it at room temperature for about an hour before refrigerating to kickstart fermentation. The starter is nice and active on its feeding day, which is a great time to build a sponge, even if you're not planning to bake that day. You can feed the starter and make the sponge at the same time. This is when I make sponge most of the time. The sponge will keep well in the fridge for days before you turn it into dough, though of course you can use it as soon as it's ready if the timing works for you. Feeding the starter and making the sponge at the same time is similar to what you just saw. The difference is that in addition to the starter jar, you'll need a larger container with a lid for the sponge. I usually start by measuring out the amount of starter I need and placing it in the sponge container, then place enough on a bench scraper to feed the starter and clean out the starter jar. Next, I add water to both the starter and the sponge, and then I'm going to add flour in the same way, 1 to each container. Then I mix each one until everything is well combined. I like to reuse things when I can, and so the little scoop you see actually came from a whey protein container that I bought. And the jar, after trying to look around for the best sourdough jars to buy one, I realized that I had them in my fridge. And when I finished some sauce, this one was great. It had the nice straight edges, the right size, it was great. So Look around and you might already have some of the stuff you can use without having to buy it. Once everything's mixed up, the starter can go back in the fridge. Although if you have time, leave it out for an hour like I said last time. It kickstarts the fermentation. If you have more than 8 hours before bedtime, leave the sponge container out. If not, put it in the fridge and then just take it out before you go to bed. It can ferment overnight. In the morning, you can put it back in the fridge, then make dough when you have time. When it comes time to make dough, take it out of the fridge about an hour before you want to make dough, just to let it warm up a bit. You don't need to do this, but it helps if you have time. A note on using the fridge: when I started, I did things at specified times, even if it meant setting an alarm at 5 a.m. It wasn't fun. Now I'm not chained to time. If I let the sponge dough rise overnight, I don't worry if it's 9 or 9.5 hours instead of exactly 8. And that makes me enjoy making sourdough even more. I usually make the dough after dinner, which is a convenient time to do folding sessions. This sponge was either started early this morning and has now been fermenting for at least 8 hours, or it was made and fermented earlier in the week and taken out of the fridge about an hour ago to warm up a bit. The order you add the ingredients isn't especially important. This is just the method I find best for mixing everything together. I start by putting the sponge into a large mixing bowl, then I add the water, followed by olive oil. I said I'm particular about amounts of ingredients. That's for the flour, water, and starter. I'm not too particular with salt and olive oil. I've developed a feel and I eyeball it. Loosely mix the sponge into the liquid for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, just enough to break the sponge up a bit. I'm not fully incorporating it at this stage. Next, add the flour so it covers the liquid, then sprinkle salt over top. It's best not to put the salt directly onto the sponge. Using the handle of a wooden spoon, or something similar, stir in a circular motion until most of the ingredients are combined. You'll still have some flour around the sides of the bowl and a bit at the bottom. I bought one of those fancy dough mixing tools, but honestly an upside down wooden spoon is still my favorite for mixing the dough. Switch to a spatula and scrape down the sides of the bowl. Lightly wet your hands, the dough will be very sticky. Using the spatula with a bit of help from your hand, lift and fold sections of the dough, bringing in dry flour from underneath as you go. And don't worry about incorporating every last bit. Stop when everything is mostly combined. The dough will look shaggy and a bit rough, and that's exactly what you're after. It doesn't need to come together yet. As it rests between folds, the moisture will gradually absorb into the flour and the dough will smooth out. Most recipes call for plastic wrap at this stage. We try and follow the reduce, reuse, recycle idea around here. And in Canada, milk often comes in bags instead of jugs. So I cut and wash the milk bag and reuse it with elastic instead of plastic wrap. Cover the bowl and let the dough sit for about 30 minutes. After that, it's time for the first folding session. There are 3 folding sessions, spaced 30 minutes apart after mixing the dough. The first 2 are the same and the third has a couple extra steps. Start with the first session about 30 minutes after mixing. By now, most of the dry flour will have hydrated and the dough will be starting to come together. Lightly wet your hands, the dough will be sticky. From here on, you don't need the spatula. Keeping the dough in the bowl, use one hand to lift a section, fold it over, press it down gently, then rotate the bowl and repeat. Continue until the dough begins to feel a bit tighter, usually 5 to 8 folds. Cover the bowl again and let it rest for another 30 minutes. When you come back for the second folding session, you'll notice the dough is smoother and more elastic. Repeat the same folding process. Lightly wet your hands, keeping the dough in the bowl. Use a hand to lift up a section, fold it over, press it down, rotate the bowl and repeat. Continue until the dough feels tighter, usually about 5 to 8 folds. Then cover and rest it again for another 30 minutes. If you're making dough for just one loaf, repeat the same folding process for the third fold. I usually make enough dough for multiple loaves, and today I'm baking a batch for 3. During the third and final folding session, I divide the dough before doing the folds. One portion will be used to make bread tomorrow. After rising overnight, I put the remaining dough in the fridge for another day. It works better to divide the dough first and then fold each portion separately. To divide the dough evenly, I weigh the full batch. This one is usually around 1,050 grams. I use the scale to portion it out, 1/3, in this case 350 grams, for bread that I'll bake tomorrow. Do a folding session for each portion. I start with a smaller one in the mixing bowl, fold it, and then cover it. It's still early in the evening, which is too soon to leave it out overnight, so I put the covered bowl in the fridge for now. Then I fold a larger portion, place it in a container with a lid, and keep it in the fridge for another day. You can keep the dough in the fridge for several days before baking. It will continue to rise very slowly, and if it puffs up after a couple days, just give it another fold and put it back. It gives me a lot of flexibility. I can mix one batch of dough and bake a few loaves over the course of the week instead of repeating the whole process 3 separate times during the week. Before bedtime, pull out the batch in the mixing bowl to rise overnight. It should roughly double in size, and this usually takes around 8 hours depending on temperature. It's the next morning. It's risen for 8 hours. The mixing bowl looks different here, green instead of glass, because I messed up the filming. This is actually dough I made a couple days later. It's finished rising and it's ready to be knocked back and shaped. I don't use the cloth liner that comes with a proofing basket. I dust flour directly onto the basket instead, and over time the basket gets seasoned with flour and becomes naturally less sticky. Next, I sprinkle a little flour on the counter. I really like using a small handheld sieve or strainer for dusting flour evenly. Transfer the dough onto the lightly floured surface and gently flatten it and press out most of the air bubbles. If you hear little pops of air or you hear air coming out, keep pressing gently until the bubbles are mostly gone. And now you shape it for the oval basket. It's different if you're doing it round. Fold the top down past the middle and press. Fold the bottom up past the top edge, press and flatten. Fold the left side over just past the middle and press. Fold the right side over just past the left and press. Flatten it more, and then start folding the top right corner down towards the center and repeat the top left corner. Rotate the dough 180 degrees and repeat the corner folds on the top side. The dough should be roughly football shaped. Fold it in half along the center seam, and using your fingers, press the seam together and tuck in any excess dough to make it a clean seal. Place the seam against the counter and gently pound it together using the knife edge of your hand. Lightly roll the seam on the counter to smooth it out and place it seam side up into the basket. Next, I clean off the counter. We somehow ended up with a small bench scraper. I didn't buy it for bread making, but it's perfect for the job. Scrape off the flour, then wash the counter. Lay a tea towel on the counter and place the basket in the middle. Fold the towel over the basket and let it rest like this for about 2 hours. This will be the second rise. 2 hours after you put the dough in the basket, put your empty Dutch oven into the oven and preheat to 480 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll notice later that when the oven is hot, I open the door and pause for a few seconds before reaching in. When you first open the oven, there's a rush of hot air. Waiting a few seconds avoids the blast of heat in your face. Take the Dutch oven out before you score the bread. Have some hot pads ready for the pot and lid. I'm gentle removing the dough from the basket. It can collapse a bit if you rip it. Ripping it also affects the shape when baking, and you can rip it if you pull it out of the basket too fast. Scoring is just cutting the surface of the dough before it goes in the oven. It's worth getting a lame, which is a small razor on a handle made for bread. A plain razor blade will work too. You'll notice that I've put a bit of tape on one side of the razor. I've nicked myself a couple times, so I cover the side I'm not using as a simple precaution. You can use a sharp knife, but a lame gives you much better control and a cleaner cut. I've tried a range of scoring patterns, but I've settled on 2 I like best. The one you see in the video is a single cut along the top, slightly off to one side. That's my go-to. The other is a series of about 6 short cuts across the top, which gives a kind of tiger stripe or honeybee stripe look. We like a few sesame seeds on top. I spray it with water and sprinkle on some seeds. Yes, my water sprayer is another reuse item. Bake it covered with a lid on. This is a small loaf. Bake it for 37 minutes. You can download the recipe from the link in the notes. It also includes ingredient amounts for medium and large loaves. Try about 40 minutes for a medium loaf and 43 minutes for a large loaf. Adjust if needed. A lot of sourdough baking is experimenting. Every oven behaves a little differently. Use this recipe as a starting point, then adjust, for example, the flour or water and baking time to suit your setup. Over time, you'll find the combination that works best for your kitchen. Cold slows things down, and using the fridge gives you flexibility. With starter, I find that 1 day in the fridge is roughly equivalent to 1 hour out of the fridge at room temperature. You can leave sponge or dough in the fridge for days before use. By using the fridge at different stages, you could fit bread making into your day. I do something different if I do the second rise in the fridge in the basket. I use my cut plastic bag for a liner for the tea towel. It prevents the outside of the dough from getting hard if it's in the fridge for a long time. And if you have time before baking, let it warm at room temperature for about an hour. Take the plastic liner off before you let it sit for that hour. This is a bonus section to deal with a problem we all run into. My starter has gone flat. I didn't feed it last week, I was gone, and now I need to revive it. I've come up with a system that works well. Essentially, I just feed it twice in a row. I don't use the fridge. So in this case, I'm doing the normal starter, and you can see earlier in the recipe the amounts and how to do it. And I'm taking kind of the flat, deflated starter, and I'm going to make a new batch with it. I'm then going to leave it on the counter for at least 8 hours so it can become active. But I find that it's not as active as I want after the first feed after it's deflated. So then after the first time it weighs for 8 hours, it gets more active. I'm going to feed it again, and then the next time it'll be ready for use. This is what it looked like after I waited 8 hours. It looks pretty good, but I know from experience, as I said, that I want to get it more active, and I can do that by feeding it a second time before use. I'm going through the same process you've seen earlier in the video about how to feed my starter. I also need to think about how long to leave it out of the fridge when it's done after the second feeding. There's a bit of a formula. So let's say this is my Wednesday starter. How long I leave it out on the counter before I put it in the fridge depends on what day I'm reviving it. If I'm reviving it on Monday, I leave it out for 5 hours because it missed Wednesday to Sunday in the fridge, roughly about an hour per day. If I'm reviving it on Friday, I'll leave it out 2 hours because it missed Wednesday and Thursday. So do that math in terms of leaving it out, and that way when you put it back in the fridge, it'll be on the regular schedule when you want to pull it out, in this case, Wednesday.